Why aren't we having good sex, baby? Is it 'cause I'm too kinky? Let's listen to this podcast and figure out why that may be. You are
Oh
welcome,
man.
listeners. We actually just came up with that.
I don't know if you could tell because of its poetic nuance. It was pretty impressive.
Anyways, hi, I'm Jesse.
Hi, I'm Ryan, and you're listening to Your Therapist Is Not Okay.
We certainly are not. In case you couldn't tell by my jingle, today we're going to be talking all about how sex in your relationship may be an issue. Why you're not having good sex, why you're not talking about sex, and why this might be.
We're going to follow the usual kind of pattern we've been doing recently, where today we're going to talk all about some of the challenges and problems that we hear about in our offices, that we've heard about and experienced in life. And then in our next episode, we'll talk about what we can maybe do about that. So this is a huge topic that comes into the therapy room, that comes up in relationships. Um, because sex is, for many people, a really important part of their lives that also comes with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of mystery, a lot of social expectations about whether we're allowed to talk about it at all, how we're allowed to talk about it, who we're allowed to talk about it with. And so generally, we find people may have just not had any of these conversations out loud.
Oh, yeah. Like in my office, it usually takes a while before we're able to talk about sex. And this is different from our episode where we talked about sex necessarily in the therapy room. Obviously, listen to that episode because it'll tie in quite closely here. But this is about us with our partner and really the problems that can arise here. And one of the main ones is this idea of like real frustration of not having sex, or it becomes obligatory and pressured, or that your sexual desire to your partner actually shifts. That's become one of the major issues that can happen in my office, truthfully.
Absolutely, yeah. So common to have someone say like, "Oh, we're not having sex. What's wrong with us? What am I
Hmm.
doing wrong? What's going on with this?" We also hear a lot about folks maybe not feeling satisfied by sex, feeling like they
Hmm.
don't like the sex they're having, they're not enjoying it as much as maybe they think that they should be.
Hmm.
Um, and a lot of that can be when there's difficulty around communicating about stress or just like feeling like, oh, we can't find our rhythm, we're not having fun, we're not experiencing as much pleasure as we want to. My partner doesn't know what I want or how to please me. Just basically experiences where the sex isn't feeling good.
This can come up especially when you're reading literature or you're
Mm.
watching movies where sex is supposed to be this explosion, this passion. And when your own life, you're struggling with that, it can feel really dissatisfying that your partner doesn't live up to maybe what everywhere else we're seeing does, even if it's literature, like in fantasy or romantasy or in movies. Absolutely. And the other thing that I think becomes a real problem for sex in relationships is that this is one of those topics you don't talk about with your partner. It's uncomfortable, and we don't even know how to bring it up. If we have a desire or something we don't like, it's really difficult to bring it up, either after, even in the act. And also, society still shames sex. It's not something that is a common topic.
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean, thinking about what you're saying about the media portrayals of sex being this explosive and incredible thing, it's interesting that within, especially North American society, and a lot of Western society, there is kind of this built-in conflict of you're supposed to be having amazing sex, but no one should ever know about it and you should ever talk about it. So there's this combination of glorification and stigma,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to airing any concerns or problems with it. Like you shouldn't have a problem. It should just like come naturally. You should always have this like, movie cinema quality, explosive, passionate sex. So there's the stigma around the sex itself, and then there's kind of an added layer of stigma for struggling with sex. And these are kind of going to be the topics that we dive into today. That's kind of a quick little outline of what you can expect. And we're gonna start with that common question of like, why aren't we having sex anymore? And do we
Mm,
want to be having sex? Um, this can be a big concern that comes up, especially after relationships have been going for a little while, right? It's not uncommon for in new relationships for there to be a period of time when a lot of what you do together is more sexual. Once you start having sex, having that intimacy, not everyone, but often that becomes one of the main things at the beginning of a relationship, that each time you see each other, you're really excited to connect physically and have a lot of fun and explore that together. That often changes a little bit with time and with seeing each other regularly, where there will be more times when maybe you don't have sex, where it's more about just spending quality time together, having more companionship. But during the kind of transition between those parts of a relationship, which are again different for everyone, how that shows up. But people start to have these questions of like, are we not having enough sex? Do I still want to have sex with this person? Like, what's going on here?
in psychology, we call this passionate love versus companionate love.
Mhm.
And in our episode, the first one on conflict, we talked about this honeymoon phase and how we're not maybe having conflict during that time. Let's kind of pull that and think about it through this lens.
Mhm.
As you were saying, in that passionate phase, there's a lot of exhilaration, a lot of excitement, and anxiety that usually gets tied up with those two emotions. Are we going to tonight? We might get dressed up and clean up down there. Make sure that we are like ready just in case. There's this will we, won't we? That actually creates a level of passion and excitement because it's not a given. But companionate stage usually is likened to when the honeymoon phase ends. And what it usually means is actually something lovely. It's when you're comfortable with your partner, when you know so much about them and there's love involved, maybe you've moved in together. There's something about that relationship that's now safe. And one of the first things to go when it's safe, sadly, is that passionate sexual connection.
Yeah, I've seen this kind of depicted on a graph before, right? So with that passionate stage, there's a quick spike in the intensity and the feelings, and even like the neurotransmitters of that experience. It shoots up and then it drops off fairly quickly, whereas the companionate love has a very gradual and slow incline. So there comes this point at which the passionate has dropped and the companionate has not come up anywhere near to where the passionate is yet. So there's this kind of in-between gap in the graph where there's not so much excitement, there's not so much connection and feeling of intimacy because one is building really slowly. It takes a long time to get to know someone at that kind of deep level and build the safety and trust and understand each other beyond understanding what makes each other come.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's safe, but it's not exactly sexy. And it's not as intimate as it's going to be. Yeah, that
Right.
transitionary phase. It's
Hmm.
also the time where you're building a pattern. Usually, patterns can come in all sorts of ways in the passionate, for sure. But it's in that transitionary time where the patterns of long-lasting communication, intimacy, day-to-day rhythms become established. And if that pattern is that we're not going to have sex, or that we're not going to talk about sex, or I'm not going to share some of the desires I have within sex, I may not want to have it.
Yeah, absolutely. It may just become this thing where we don't know what the other person really wants, and we're afraid to say what we want. We're afraid to give feedback often when it comes to sex as well, because it can feel like, oh, that would be really hurtful to hear. How are they going to receive it? And this is challenging as both the person saying it and receiving it. So there are always going to be these hang-ups about like, oh, I can't say what I want. And you kind of, it's not something we're really taught to do. No one really
Oh,
gives us this toolkit of like, here's how you tell your partner what feels good to your body.
yeah, those needs being met again. This is becoming
Hmm.
a theme in some of the things we're talking about of like, what does my body need?
Hmm.
This is one of those ones where in therapy, you may want to talk to your therapist about this because we're not often taught what we want or what feels good or how to stimulate certain areas to have that like really erotic connection. We might go through the motions with a partner in the early passionate stages, not knowing how to talk to them about it. And then none of that really gets established of like,
Hmm.
how do you actually please me? How would I
Hmm.
like to be pleased?
And they can just having those conversations, I'd say, in therapy can be a way to kind of start to warm up to thinking about what is true for me so that I could communicate it later. And we'll get more into that next episode when we're kind of talking about what we think you can do about this communication to get over these kind of hurdles and get back to a more passionate feeling or settle into the pattern that feels right for you and your partner or partners.
There's another way that can be tricky. We were talking about not satisfying sex before in the beginning of this episode. There's also sexual problems that can
Hmm.
arise that can be really difficult to know how to navigate with your partner. For many folks, erectile dysfunction is actually something that can be really tricky to know what to
Hmm.
do with. It can have multiple causes, physiologically, anxiety, but it can also be really shaming to know what to do with, especially because it happens in the moment, in the act of sex, that can often derail the whole experience.
Yeah, this is one of those places too where the stigma around sex becomes a really big issue because it's one of those things where it's like, well, this should be easy, this should just work. There's this kind of presumption. I laugh about this in movies, whether the traditional movies or even with porn or something, where people are just like always perfectly ready to have sex and like everything goes perfectly smoothly. This is not reality, right? There's usually some prep
Yeah.
people need to take it for it. Like, sometimes the spontaneity works out great or whatever. And every body is different as well. And our bodies change throughout time as well. Um, there's such a feedback loop often with with erectile dysfunction where there starts to be a challenge. Things get awkward and uncomfortable, and then the anxiety spikes up as well, and then it gets even harder. So it becomes a spiral where well, I should say where things don't get harder. And that's really challenging. People get really in their
Yeah.
heads about it, and where there might be some erectile dysfunction that's just like a normal part of life. Maybe it's what you ate or didn't eat that day, or that you're tired or whatever. But then that kind of gets into some folks' heads, and then they're like, oh, anxious about it the next time. And then that leads to anxiety-induced erectile dysfunction.
And oftentimes, an erection is an indicator for a partner on how desired they are.
Yes.
Losing an erection can make the partner feel like they're not desired, the person's not really into it. It becomes this thing that has so many more meanings than
Mm.
often the physiological that can happen.
Yeah, absolutely true. Absolutely. And it's a very difficult topic to broach and have a conversation about because it gets really tied up in people's sense of masculinity and then the other receptive partner's sense of desire, like Jesse was saying, that like, am I doing things right? Am I satisfying you? Am I good enough? Right? It brings up so many things. Are you still attracted to me?
Yeah.
It brings up a ton of stuff like that. Not the only medical kind of thing that can come up in sex, right? There can be painful sex where there's injury or tightness or all kinds of things that are kind of unplanned for with a receptive partner. Other medical stuff that's not directly about sex could impact it too. If a partner has had heart problems, if a partner is having mobility issues. Of course, none of these things preclude anyone from having sex, but it does mean that there are maybe changes and adaptations that folks need to make to have sex comfortably, safely, and kind of get over the hurdles of um, these physical and mental health challenges that do come into it.
And this is where shame becomes very important in this conversation
Mhm.
because shame can be attached to sex so easily. First of all, how we don't talk about it, the stigma for sure. But again, in how we're having sex, are we able to perform correctly the way we're supposed to in sex? A lot of women will say that there's a performative element to how they're supposed to have sex, where it's less about their pleasure.
Mm,
And how do you talk about that idea of, yep, desirability? Do you still want me? What does this mean?
right.
Sex then becomes something that's not just fun and for connection. It becomes something that's multi-layered into the dimension of the relationship.
Absolutely. And that kind of the interaction between shame and the expectations that we see in the media also kind of give us these really heavy messages of this is how sex should go. These are the things that people find desirable, which are actually just not true. It varies greatly from person to person who likes to give and receive different types of oral sex or different types of penetrative sex, or who likes to use toys, who likes to engage in other kinky things. Like there's so many differences in how people experience pleasure and desire. And they're not always going to align with your partner or partners, that you might be like, I really want to do this thing, and they really don't.
Yep.
And then if you're able to have a conversation about it, then you can maybe figure out solutions and ways you want to navigate it. But if we just stay stuck in that point of shame and just don't want to ever think about it or talk about it, it's not going to resolve itself. And
No,
that's where we encounter a lot of folks in our practices. Is like we're stuck at this. We don't know how to move past it. And we're not having a good time. Maybe we're having less and less sex because every time we have it, it's frustrating.
we're going through the motions, but we're not actually as engaged as we once were.
Right.
Absolutely. And then fantasy and what we do desire takes much more of a center stage because the reality of what we're having doesn't match. And we are
Mm,
not allowing ourselves a conversation to try to bridge that gap.
absolutely.
And I think that that's what moves us into another further silence in sex,
Hmm.
which is about what we want. And sometimes what we want can actually be very difficult to talk about, especially when it has to do with something that might be labeled kinky.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And one way that people so often explore their fantasies, their desires, especially if they're unconventional or kind of kinky things, is through porn. And so we often have people in our offices talking to us about the porn they or their partner consume and how they feel about that, and kind of wondering what it means about them. Sometimes the porn that we watch is indicative of what we want to do, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just we find it hot as an entertainment kind of thing or during solo pleasure kind of activities.
Mhm. Oh, talking about porn with our partner can be so difficult. And this is for
Mm.
a number of reasons. How does our partner view porn?
Hmm.
Do they view it as a form of cheating? Do they not? Do you want to share what you like? Don't you? Why? These are things that all of a sudden can become something that becomes a solo act, but also a secretive act.
Hmm.
We're not bringing our partner into this. Porn that we might actually want to engage with our partner, it might be really hard for us to know how to bridge that. How do you talk about our fantasies with our partner? Will they be able to do it? Will I actually like it in reality? What if I wreck this relationship because they view me differently and maybe more deviantly than I want, than I am?
Hmm.
Shame. It comes into it again.
Absolutely is kind of everywhere when we're talking about sex. There are so many threats through shame, and that's one of the things we'll talk about a lot next time is how we can try our best to take the shame out of our conversations about sex and actually have those conversations in a way that is caring or loving. A lot
Absolutely.
of what we're talking about as we're saying this too is just the like gaps in our
Yep.
knowledge about our partners, gaps in our knowledge about our fantasies and our kinks. This can be really challenging. We're just like, what would this actually look like in practice? Is what I see in the porno like really how it would go? And do I really want that? Where would I even go to explore that in like a safe way or to learn about that? In some cases, one partner might have a lot more knowledge or experience in
Mm,
fantasy and kink stuff. And that could be helpful or could be intimidating. Could have one
yep.
partner really in their head about like, oh, I can't satisfy them because I don't want to do this list of things that they're into. And even just that, like I was saying, just like, how do I start? What would it mean about me if I became a person that engaged in this activity?
Mm.
Does it need to mean something about me? How will it change my relationship if I do or don't do this? And so just that's another place where bring it to therapy as well.
That knowledge gap is actually really interesting.
Yeah.
Because for the partner that might be being asked about this, that might bring up a lot of insecurities. I don't know if I know how to do that. How, if someone's asking for more of a dominant role in sex, that they'd like to be more submissive.
Mhm.
How do I be a dom? Where do I start to learn about that? What if I can't do this? What if I fail them? What if I can't provide what they want? What if I'm not good enough? And these feelings of insecurity come up a lot in sex. We are so vulnerable in sex, no matter what kind of sex you're having, how often, with whom, it doesn't really matter. It's still vulnerable.
Hmm.
And body dysmorphia can come up into that, especially when we're starting to think about what kinds of ways we want our bodies to be and look and have this in. It can be a really important conversation that's not going to be had because you have all of these insecurities and narratives attached to what we're asking for.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's important to consider very carefully, especially when we're talking about exploring more of our kinks and more of our fantasies, to really think about how to do this in a way that is safe and consensual. Kind of when we're talking about that one partner maybe wants you to be more dominant or wants to try being more dominant themselves. Um, that can bring up more of those feelings that we talked about at the beginning of like, oh, I have to, this is obligatory. I have to do this, even though it feels really not okay to me.
Mm,
And just has that become scary,
mm.
intimidating, and feel like this sense of failure. It is really important that we label here, and we're not going to dive into it a lot during this podcast, that being coerced or forced into kink and BDSM that you're not okay with, that you're not willing and excited to engage in, can be a form of abuse.
Yep.
There has to be consent. Even if you're doing some really intense things like CNC or consensual non-consent, where a partner has a fantasy about non-consent that you agree about and put limits around together beforehand. This is one of those cases where the porn's going to look really different than the reality, right? Because in the porn, it just shows it happening. It
Yep.
doesn't show the entire day probably that the crew and cast talked about. Here's how we're going to depict this. Here's what's okay and not okay for me. Here's when I would need something to stop or someone to intervene. Those things are all really important, especially if we're getting into some of those fantasy areas. So if you feel like you might be in that kind of situation, please talk to a therapist. Please reach out for help.
Oh yeah, we're here for you, 100%. And we really wanted to flag that here because we wanted to talk about consent. How do you chat about this? How do you say
Yeah.
yes? How do you
Mhm.
say yes knowing you might say no halfway through because it doesn't quite feel right for either partner? That's tricky. These things are something that can make a relationship so strong and can also be the biggest silence in a relationship. To make that even a little less about just kink, it could be when you live together with a partner and it's been 3 weeks, 3 months, and you haven't had sex. You might feel like you have to.
Mm.
Might feel like, oh, I guess we're doing it tonight. That becomes obligation. That
Mhm.
becomes something that doesn't feel exciting and feels almost like a chore. And it can greatly diminish desire because while we're having this kind of like safety in this sexual experience, we're
Mhm.
not necessarily having what the connection could have. And I think that's really important that we
Mm.
understand that having good sex means that both parties are pumped. It's a hell yes. Even if sometimes it's like, I'm tired, but yeah, let's do this. It's how
Right.
do you get there with a partner when you've been living together for years? We'll tell you
Mhm.
about that next episode for sure. But it's all about this aspect of like, how do we chat? How do we negotiate? How do we set the rules for what we want?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because it's kind of interesting to recognize that when sex becomes obligatory like that, we are maybe giving verbal consent, but it terrifies me when I hear about or when I have experienced like there's a giving of verbal consent while my body is saying no,
Yep.
while my heart is saying no. Well, it's like no, I don't want to do this. I'm agreeing for it or maybe even initiating it, but that's out of this expectation or this desire.
Mm,
So it is almost this kind of interesting thing where our we can be non-consensual with ourselves in a way because we're in a position where we feel we must force ourselves. And
yeah.
that can really start to erode the trust in the relationship. It can start to erode our sense of self as well. Um, and
And
sometimes that just being willing to talk about it. Again, talk about what feels good, what doesn't feel good. What different partners have different ways that they feel turned on, right? And
yeah.
I'm not coming to them off the top of my head, but there's some different folks have like theorized different categories of like sexual initiation. Like some people like a spontaneous, some people like a planned, like we're going to do this on Tuesday. And for some people, they're like, that sounds like so sterile or something like that. And for other people, that means like, no, it means I get to look forward to Tuesday and I'm so jazzed for it, right? So because everyone's saying jazzed these days, who am I? Really just jazzed to have sex tonight. Um,
Well, you know.
or don't you know? Um, yeah, but that different partners have different things with that, and some people like a little bit of non-sexual physical intimacy leads to arousal, and for
Oh,
some
yeah.
folks that doesn't lead to arousal. For some folks, just sitting across the room and like having a thought go through their head is like now I'm aroused. So
Yeah.
even just being able to talk about like when do you get aroused? What turns you on?
And this is the final problem that we want to say
Mm.
is that you probably weren't even taught what makes you aroused. And here's why. In any sex education course that I've seen in North America, and other countries actually do this well that are not Western
I
based,
do. I do.
sex ed is all about consent, sexually transmitted diseases, how to have birth control protection. We do not learn about pleasure, where those points of contact are, how to be touched in various ways that can give us orgasms or just deep pleasure. We don't
Mhm.
learn about kink or what we might want or what our fantasies could be. We don't learn about what might turn us on. In all of my sex therapy training, it's fascinating when you start to realize that disparity between what two partners want. And that's the thing that can be bridged.
Mm,
So realizing that you weren't taught this means that you're not the problem. There's where are you looking except for media?
right.
You're probably not necessarily having these deep chats with your friends or family. Can be an excellent place, but it can be really embarrassing when you're in your 40s having to ask this question about how
Mm,
do I give my
sure.
partner pleasure?
Yeah. And in fact, just like a little caveat there, even too, I think when I think about sex ed and what sex ed was like when I was growing up, actually, if you learned about consent, you were lucky, right? It was
Mhm.
so much about like the STIs to be afraid of and the pregnancy scares to be afraid of and like the physiology of pregnancy, right? Like that was pretty much sex ed, at least when I received it. So there are a lot of folks that are our age or older who were not taught rigorous consent, really.
No.
Yeah.
And having a safe relationship with someone, regardless of the duration, really, having a safe relationship with someone where we can explore that and allow the learning together, the
Hmm.
exploration together, that can actually be fun. That can
Yeah.
be playful. I like that word when it comes to sex because play
Mm.
means that we're saying, yes, ooh, what about? Oh, nope, let's do this. It can be something that feels much more organic and it can be liberating. So I wrote a cheeky line in our outline and I'm going to say it. I'm actually going to. You want to have good sex? Well, stay tuned next week and we're going to teach you all about how to talk about it, what ways you can experience it, what different kinks are, and what you might like. As you listen, we want you next episode to really think, does this jive with me? If it does, we're going to teach you how to talk about it.
We can't wait to talk more about good sex with you. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our others. And stay tuned for even more episodes coming up.
Follow us and leave a review on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please tell your friends.
You can also follow us on Instagram too at Your Therapist Is Not Okay. Also, if you have any questions that you want us to answer, send us a DM there. We would love to answer your questions. And a lot of our topics come from listeners just like you.